I got divorced and moved overseas. My ex-wife right away married her new guy. My son said he would be the best man. Then he added, "He is a good, wealthy man, not like you, Dad." During the wedding, a guest said one line that made her lose it, and then she called me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Living in Lisbon, Portugal at 69 years old offered a certain kind of invisibility that I deeply appreciated. I spent my mornings drinking strong espresso on a tiny sun-baked balcony overlooking the Tagus River, wearing faded linen shirts and scuffed loafers. To the casual observer, and certainly to my family back in the States, I was just another American retiree stretching a meager pension across a favorable exchange rate. My ex-wife Patricia had fought tooth and nail during our divorce 2 years ago to secure the sprawling suburban Chicago estate, the luxury cars, and all the visible liquid assets. I gave them to her without a single fight. I simply packed 2 suitcases, boarded a commercial flight, and vanished across the Atlantic. What Patricia and our son Connor never understood was that the visible wealth they fought over so viciously was merely the loose change of my life's work. The video chime on my laptop shattered the quiet hum of the Lisbon afternoon. The caller ID displayed Connor's name. We had barely spoken since the divorce was finalized. He had naturally aligned with his mother, drawn like a moth to the glamorous, high-spending lifestyle she aggressively maintained. I clicked accept. Connor appeared on the screen sitting in what looked like a high-end tailor shop. He was 28, wearing a custom-fitted tuxedo, his hair slicked back, exuding an arrogance that felt entirely foreign to the boy I had raised. He did not offer a greeting or ask how I was doing. He simply stared at the camera, his eyes scanning the cracked plaster wall behind me and the simple wooden chair I sat on. A smirk crept across his face, validating the false narrative he had constructed about my supposed financial ruin. "I am calling to give you a heads up," Connor announced, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "Mom is getting married tomorrow. I am going to be the best man." The news did not sting. Patricia's desperate need for social validation made a rapid remarriage entirely predictable. I simply nodded, keeping my face perfectly neutral, waiting for the real reason behind his sudden call. Connor leaned closer to the screen, his smirk widening. "His name is Sterling. He is a venture capitalist, a genuinely wealthy man. He provides for Mom the way you never could. He actually knows how to build an empire, Dad. Not like your little consulting firm that went absolutely nowhere, my little consulting firm." I absorbed the insult without blinking. Connor was referring to the modest front company I had used for decades to maintain a strictly low profile. He had absolutely no idea about the multi-million-dollar tech patents I had developed and sold through an anonymous holding firm, or the offshore accounts that generated more interest in a single month than Sterling likely saw in a year. I stayed completely silent, letting my son dig his own grave with his arrogance. My silence seemed to agitate him. He wanted a reaction. He wanted anger, jealousy, or tears. Finding none, he decided to twist the knife much deeper. "You need to understand something." Connor continued aggressively adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Sterling runs in an elite circle. Mom is finally where she belongs. We are moving into a completely different echelon of society now. Your situation, your whole broke expat lifestyle, it is embarrassing to us. I am calling to tell you to lose my number. Do not reach out. Do not try to contact Mom. We cannot have Sterling's associates finding out my father is scraping by in some rundown European slum. You chose to be a failure. Do not drag us down with you." The sheer audacity of his demand hung heavily in the air. This was the son I had quietly bailed out of 3 separate failed business ventures, secretly funneling money through anonymous grants so he would not feel emasculated. This was the boy I had protected from the harsh consequences of his own incompetence. I looked directly into the camera, studying the stranger wearing my son's face. He had fully bought into Patricia's superficial worldview, measuring a man's worth entirely by the brand of his suit and the zip code of his residence. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my choices or reveal my hand. I simply said, "I understand completely, Connor. Enjoy the wedding." I reached out and terminated the call. I closed the laptop. The screen went dark, reflecting my calm, stoic expression. I did not feel the fiery heat of rage. I felt a cold, absolute clarity. For years I had tolerated their disrespect to maintain family peace. I had stepped aside, allowing Patricia to claim a false victory in the divorce, hoping Connor would eventually mature and see the truth. But this brazen attempt to erase me, to discard me like garbage because I did not fit into their fabricated high society narrative, crossed a permanent line. They wanted to play a ruthless game of wealth and power. They had no idea they were sitting at a table I secretly owned. I stood up and walked to the small bookcase in the corner of my living room. I moved a stack of dusty paperbacks, revealing a biometric safe bolted directly into the masonry. Pressing my thumb to the scanner, the heavy steel door popped open. Inside lay a secure, encrypted satellite phone entirely untraceable to my public identity. I pulled it out and dialed a private Chicago number. It rang exactly twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. Dominic. Dominic and I went back 30 years. To the public, he was a ruthless corporate attorney who managed hostile takeovers and aggressively dismantled failing corporations. To me, he was my former silent partner, the only man alive who knew the exact architectural layout of my hidden financial empire. We had navigated the treacherous waters of international finance together, building a fortress of invisible wealth. Vincent Dominic's voice crackled through the encrypted line. To what do I owe the pleasure? Are you finally tired of eating salted cod and pretending to be a peasant? I need a massive favor, Dom. I walked back out to the balcony, feeling the warm Lisbon breeze against my face. Patricia is getting married tomorrow in Chicago. Some venture capitalist named Sterling. Connor just informed me that I am, an embarrassing, poverty-stricken failure who needs to vanish from their pristine lives permanently. Dominic chuckled, a low, dangerous sound that promised absolute destruction. The idiot actually believes the cover story, Dominic replied. What do you want me to do? Shut down the venue, ruin the catering. I want you to crash the reception, I instructed, my voice flat and precise as a scalpel. But I do not want a scene. I want a surgical strike. Run a comprehensive background check on this Sterling character immediately. A guy flashing that much cash marrying Patricia that fast, he is overcompensating for something massive. Find the cracks in his portfolio. I guarantee he is leveraged to the breaking point. Once you find the weak spot, I want you to walk right up to their table during the reception. I leaned against the wrought iron railing, calculating every angle. Do not yell. Do not make a grand toast. Just walk up to Sterling, smile, and casually drop the bomb. Tell him exactly what is about to happen to his assets. Let Patricia and Connor watch his billionaire facade shatter in real time. Leave your business card and then walk out. Dominic let out a low whistle of appreciation. You want me to publicly detonate his net worth right after they cut the cake? I love it. I will have my analysts tear his financials apart within the hour. By tomorrow night, I will know what he ate for breakfast and who he owes money to. Consider it my wedding gift to the happy couple, I said. Dominic agreed and disconnected the line. I stood on the balcony for a long time, watching the massive cargo ships navigate the deep, dark waters of the Atlantic. Connor thought he had mercilessly cut the dead weight from his life. He thought his new stepfather's visible wealth made him untouchable and superior. He was about to learn a brutal, unforgiving lesson about the distinct difference between looking rich and possessing actual invisible power. The silent adjustment of their reality had officially begun, and I was going to execute it without ever leaving this balcony. I got divorced and moved overseas. My ex-wife right away married her new guy. My son said he would be the best man. Then he added that her new husband was a good, wealthy man and nothing like me. During the wedding reception, a guest delivered a single sentence that made her lose her entire fabricated life and then she called me begging for salvation. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your true worth. Living in Lisbon at 69 years old offered a specific kind of invisibility that I deeply appreciated. I spent my mornings drinking strong espresso on a tiny sun-baked balcony overlooking the Tagus River, wearing faded linen shirts and scuffed leather loafers. To any casual observer, and certainly to my family back in the United States, I was just another American retiree stretching a meager pension across a favorable currency exchange rate. My ex-wife Sylvia had fought tooth and nail during our divorce 2 years ago to secure the sprawling suburban Chicago estate, the luxury cars, and all the visible liquid assets. I gave those items to her without a single argument or legal battle. I simply packed 2 suitcases, boarded a commercial flight, and vanished across the Atlantic Ocean. What Sylvia and our son Wyatt never understood was that the visible wealth they fought over so viciously was merely the loose change of my actual life work. The video chime on my laptop shattered the quiet hum of the pleasant Portuguese afternoon. The caller identification displayed Wyatt on the screen. We had barely spoken since the divorce papers were finalized by the judge. He had naturally aligned with his mother, drawn entirely to the glamorous, high-spending lifestyle she aggressively maintained in my absence. I clicked the button to accept the incoming transmission. Wyatt appeared on the screen sitting in what looked like a high-end tailor shop surrounded by expensive fabrics. He was 28 years old, wearing a custom-fitted tuxedo with his hair slicked back. He exuded an arrogance that felt entirely foreign to the boy I had patiently raised. He did not offer a greeting or inquire about my health. He simply stared at the camera, allowing his eyes to scan the cracked plaster wall behind me and the simple wooden chair I occupied. A highly condescending smirk crept across his face, validating the false narrative he had constructed regarding my supposed financial ruin. He announced his reason for calling was to provide a mandatory courtesy notice. He stated that his mother was getting married tomorrow afternoon at a luxury country club. He proudly declared his official role as the best man for the ceremony. The news of the wedding did not sting my pride in the slightest. Sylvia possessed a desperate need for constant social validation, making a rapid remarriage entirely predictable to anyone who knew her psychological profile. I simply nodded at the screen, keeping my facial expression perfectly neutral, while waiting for the real reason behind his sudden digital appearance. Wyatt leaned closer to the camera lens, allowing his smirk to widen into a malicious grin. He stated the new groom was named Bennett and described him as a highly successful venture capitalist. He claimed Bennett provided for his mother the way I never could during our 4 decades of marriage. He specifically praised his new stepfather for knowing how to build a massive financial empire. He then directly insulted my career by calling my old business a pathetic little consulting firm that went absolutely nowhere. I absorbed the vicious insult without blinking or breaking eye contact. Wyatt was referring to the modest front company I had utilized for decades to maintain a strictly low profile in the corporate world. My son had absolutely no idea about the multi-million-dollar technology patents I had developed and quietly sold through an anonymous holding firm. He remained entirely ignorant of the offshore investment accounts that generated more compound interest in a single month than his new wealthy stepfather likely saw in an entire fiscal year. I stayed completely silent, letting my son dig his own grave with his unearned arrogance. My stoic silence seemed to severely agitate him. He clearly wanted a dramatic reaction involving anger or pathetic tears. Finding none, he decided to twist the emotional knife much deeper into our fractured relationship. He aggressively adjusted his expensive silk tie and issued a harsh directive. He demanded I understand that Bennett ran in an elite circle of powerful investors. He claimed his mother was finally existing in the upper echelon of society where she truly belonged. He stated they were moving into a completely different stratosphere of wealth and influence. He then characterized my current situation and my quiet expatriate lifestyle as a severe embarrassment to his new family dynamic. He ordered me to permanently delete his phone number and never attempt to contact his mother again. He claimed he could not risk Bennett's powerful associates, discovering that his biological father was scraping by in some rundown European slum. He finalized his monologue by stating I had chosen to be a failure and demanded I not drag his new family down with my poverty. The sheer audacity of his demand hung heavily in the digital air between us. This was the exact same son I had quietly bailed out of 3 separate failed business ventures over the past 5 years. I had secretly funneled thousands of dollars through anonymous corporate grants, just so he would not feel emasculated by his own commercial incompetence. I had shielded him from the harsh legal consequences of his reckless financial decisions. I looked directly into the camera lens, studying the cruel stranger wearing my son's face. He had fully embraced Sylvia's superficial worldview that measured a man's worth entirely by the designer label inside his suit jacket and the prestige of his residential zip code. I did not raise my voice to defend my choices. I did not reveal my hidden hand or correct his deeply flawed assumptions regarding my net worth. I simply stated that I understood his terms completely and wished him an enjoyable wedding day. I reached out and terminated the video connection permanently. I closed the laptop, allowing the screen to go dark. The reflection on the monitor showed my calm and analytical expression. I did not feel the fiery heat of paternal rage. I felt a cold and absolute mental clarity. For years, I had tolerated their blatant disrespect to maintain a fragile illusion of family peace. I had deliberately stepped aside to let Sylvia claim a false victory in the divorce settlement, hoping Wyatt would eventually mature and recognize the truth. But this brazen attempt to erase me from existence because I did not fit their fabricated high society narrative crossed a permanent psychological line. They wanted to play a ruthless game involving wealth and social power. They had no idea they were sitting at a high-stakes table that I secretly owned and operated. I stood up from my wooden chair and walked to the small bookcase located in the corner of my living room. I moved a stack of dusty paperbacks, revealing a biometric safe bolted directly into the structural masonry of the apartment. I pressed my thumb against the glowing scanner, and the heavy steel door popped open silently. Inside the vault lay a secure, encrypted satellite phone entirely untraceable to my public identity. I pulled the device out and dialed a private Chicago phone number. The line rang exactly twice before a gruff and highly familiar voice answered the call. It was Leon. Leon and I shared a deeply complicated history spanning 30 years of corporate warfare. To the general public, he was a ruthless defense attorney who managed hostile takeovers and aggressively dismantled failing corporations for sport. To me, he was my former silent partner and the only man alive who knew the exact architectural layout of my hidden financial empire. We had navigated the treacherous waters of international finance together, building a fortress of invisible wealth. Leon answered the encrypted line by asking if I was finally tired of eating salted cod and pretending to be a humble peasant. I ignored his attempt at humor and walked back out onto the sunlit balcony. I stated I needed a massive operational favor executed immediately. I explained that Sylvia was getting married tomorrow afternoon in Chicago to a venture capitalist named Bennett. I detailed how my son had just informed me that I was an embarrassing, poverty-stricken failure who needed to vanish from their pristine lives. Leon chuckled darkly through the receiver, promising absolute destruction for their ignorance. He noted the sheer stupidity of my family actually believing the cover story I had maintained for decades. He asked what specific actions I required him to take to rectify the situation. I instructed him to run a comprehensive background check on this Bennett character immediately. I guaranteed a man flashing that much sudden cash was overcompensating for massive leveraged debt. I told Leon to find the structural cracks in Bennett's portfolio and then physically crash the wedding reception tomorrow. I explicitly ordered him to walk right up to the head table and publicly detonate Bennett's net worth in front of the entire high society crowd. The silent adjustment of their fabricated reality had officially begun. 3 hours passed since Dominic delivered the fatal blow in Chicago. The Lisbon evening air felt crisp against my face as I watched the streetlights reflect off the Tagus River. My encrypted satellite phone vibrated against the wrought iron patio table, the screen illuminated with a Chicago area code. Patricia never used my international number unless she wanted to bypass my attorney. I swiped the screen to accept the connection. Frantic hyperventilating immediately assaulted the speaker. Patricia sounded entirely unrecognizable from the poised socialite who had finalized our divorce settlement 2 years prior. Background noise filtered through the audio. I could distinctly hear hotel security guards issuing firm commands and luggage wheels scraping across polished marble floors. Patricia choked on a sob before finally speaking my name. She demanded to know what I had done to her pristine wedding reception. I took a slow sip of my espresso and replied that I was merely enjoying a quiet European evening. She screamed that federal agents had just frozen every single bank account tied to Sterling. She accused me of hiring Dominic to spread malicious rumors that ruined the most important night of her life. I clarified that Dominic only spoke verifiable facts and suggested she direct her anger at her new husband. Her words tumbled out in a chaotic rush of sheer panic. The hotel management had physically locked them out of the bridal suite precisely 10 minutes after the cake-cutting ceremony. Sterling had attempted to hand the concierge his titanium corporate card to resolve a supposedly minor billing discrepancy regarding the caterers. The terminal rejected the transaction instantly with a hard fraud code. He tried 3 more premium credit cards from different financial institutions. The banking system declined every single one and flagged his accounts for international money laundering protocols. Patricia described standing in her custom silk gown while the hotel manager publicly demanded immediate alternative payment for the $50,000 reception. Her elite circle of friends had watched the entire humiliating spectacle unfold from the main lobby. She told me how the wealthy socialites she spent months impressing suddenly turned their backs and whispered behind their hands. The embarrassment compounded when the valet desk called the front counter over the loudspeaker. 2 commercial tow trucks had just secured Sterling's leased luxury sports cars from the exclusive parking zone. The repossession agents presented court orders citing 3 months of severe payment delinquency. Patricia paused her frantic recounting to catch her breath. The ambient noise of the hotel lobby grew louder as the management apparently ordered them off the premises. Her tone abruptly shifted from rage to pathetic pleading. She asked me to wire $75,000 into her personal checking account immediately. She specifically referenced the emergency alimony clause from our original separation agreement. I reminded her calmly that she had officially waived her right to any spousal support during our final mediation. She had sat across a long mahogany table and laughed at my retirement pension, claiming she would rather starve than accept a single dime of my mediocre savings. She had boldly stated that her new social circles found my modest lifestyle utterly repulsive and beneath her new standards. Now she was begging for that exact same money to cover her humiliated husband's fraudulent wedding tab. I pointed out the bitter irony of her asking the man she discarded to fund the very celebration of her infidelity. I asked her point blank why a prominent venture capitalist could not simply call his own bank and clear up a supposedly routine administrative freeze. My direct question shattered her remaining composure. Patricia admitted Sterling was currently detained in the hotel manager's office, actively dodging phone calls from furious investors. She confessed that his entire corporate portfolio consisted of highly volatile leveraged assets, heavily reliant on constant cash flow. Dominic's public announcement regarding the federal audit had triggered a massive panic among Sterling's private backers. His primary investors immediately pulled their funding, creating a catastrophic liquidity crisis. The banks recognized the sudden mass withdrawal and executed automated protective freezes across his entire financial network. I maintained my perfectly flat tone and asked why his personal assets were not shielding them from this corporate fallout. Patricia began to weep openly into the receiver. The sound of her crying offered absolutely no satisfaction to me. It simply confirmed the absolute foolishness of her superficial ambitions. She admitted Sterling had no actual personal wealth. His entire lifestyle was funded through elaborate corporate loans and dangerous margin accounts. The luxury cars, the tailored suits, and the country club memberships were all rented illusions designed to attract gullible targets like her. The truth finally spilled out of her trembling mouth as the situation escalated. Sterling needed massive liquid capital last month to maintain the illusion of his venture firm's solvency. He convinced Patricia to leverage the sprawling suburban house she had fought so viciously to take from me during our divorce proceedings. I had legally relinquished my half of that multi-million-dollar property to ensure a swift and quiet separation. Patricia proudly viewed that estate as her ultimate victory prize over my supposedly failed career. Now she confessed that Sterling persuaded her to sign a deeply predatory bridge loan using the house as the sole collateral. She blindly trusted his billionaire persona and completely ignored the exorbitant interest rates buried in the fine print of the contract. She needed my emergency wire transfer to cover the initial balloon payment due at midnight. Failing to pay would instantly trigger a total default clause, resulting in immediate foreclosure. She sobbed that Connor was pacing the hotel lobby utterly terrified because he had co-signed the catering contract to impress Sterling. I looked out over the darkened European city. The pieces of my retaliation strategy were locking together flawlessly. Patricia demanded to know if I was authorizing the bank transfer to save her home and protect our son from legal liability. I informed her that I would never send a single cent to bail out a fraudulent thief who insulted my life's work. I told her that relying on a shiny facade instead of a solid foundation always ends in collapse. I ended the call while she was mid-sentence and placed the phone back onto the table. Her desperate financial situation directly paved the way for my next calculated maneuver involving the hidden ownership of that very same loan. I opened my laptop and prepared to access the secure network that controlled the fate of her precious suburban estate. I opened my heavy aluminum laptop on the small metal table facing the Tagus River and initiated the secure digital connection to my offshore banking portal. The login process required a highly calibrated biometric scan, followed by a rotating 16-digit alphanumeric code synchronized to a physical token I kept hidden inside a floor safe. The screen illuminated with the complex dashboard of Apex Holdings. This was the anonymous corporate entity I had established 15 years ago to manage the massive proceeds from a series of proprietary algorithmic patents. I developed and sold these digital security frameworks to overseas tech conglomerates during my frequent solitary nights. Patricia always believed my long hours in the basement office were spent doing low-level data entry for a failing logistics company. She never possessed the patience or the intellect to understand the intricate architecture of the software I was building. I routed the multi-million-dollar payouts through a labyrinth of international shell companies, ensuring my legal domestic income remained entirely unremarkable. The divorce proceedings 2 years ago had been a masterpiece of financial misdirection on my part. I navigated through the encrypted portal to a specific subsidiary account designated exclusively for domestic real estate acquisitions. During our bitter mediation, Patricia had aggressively demanded full ownership of the sprawling suburban Chicago estate. She viewed that 5-bedroom property with its manicured lawns and heated pool as the ultimate symbol of her social superiority and her decisive victory over my supposedly stagnant career. I legally surrendered the title to her without offering a single argument or protest. My quick compliance made her incredibly smug and deeply satisfied. She failed to realize that less than a month after the divorce decree was finalized, her original mortgage lender sold the remaining debt to a private equity group. That private equity group was wholly owned and operated by Apex Holdings. I had covertly purchased the financial paper on her pristine sanctuary. She spent the last 2 years boasting to her elite country club friends about her glamorous independence while unknowingly writing her monthly mortgage checks directly to my offshore accounts. I became her invisible landlord, possessing the absolute legal authority to dictate the strict terms of her continued residency. I pulled up the real-time financial tracking software and opened the digital file containing the active lien on the Chicago estate. The dashboard displayed a dense cluster of urgent red notifications generated over the past 72 hours. Sterling had engaged in a catastrophically reckless financial maneuver to maintain his fabricated billionaire persona. He had somehow convinced Patricia to leverage the massive equity in the suburban home to secure a high-yield bridge loan from an aggressive secondary lender. The rigid terms of that specific loan blatantly violated the core covenants of the original mortgage agreement currently held by my company. By attaching a secondary lien to the property without obtaining prior written authorization, Sterling automatically triggered a severe default clause. The system algorithms had already generated the preliminary foreclosure documents and flagged the account for immediate legal action. Sterling was fully aware that the primary note holder had the legal right to seize the property and commence rapid eviction proceedings. His luxury assets were completely frozen, and his venture capital investors were rapidly pulling their capital following the public disaster at the wedding reception. Sterling needed a massive infusion of untraceable liquid capital before the end of the current business day to cure the default and prevent his new wife from becoming legally homeless. I watched the live banking ledger confirm that the bridge loan lender had already issued a formal demand for the initial balloon payment. The financial walls were closing in on him with cold mathematical precision. He possessed no actual personal wealth to cover the staggering deficit. His entire corporate identity was constructed on a fragile foundation of borrowed money, deceptive margin accounts, and constant capital rotation. I poured another cup of dark espresso and waited patiently for his inevitable next move. A cornered predator will always seek the easiest available prey to ensure its own immediate survival. I knew Sterling would manipulate the most vulnerable and gullible asset in his immediate vicinity to escape the impending financial slaughter. My son was the only remaining target with potential access to uncontested substantial funds. A piercing electronic chime suddenly emanated from my laptop speakers. The primary security interface flashed a bright yellow warning banner across the center of the high-resolution screen. An unauthorized user was actively attempting to breach a highly secure dormant family trust fund located in a private New York bank. I had established this specific trust 2 decades ago as an irrevocable fail-safe mechanism intended exclusively to protect my son from total financial ruin. The fund contained a substantial block of diversified municipal bonds and blue-chip dividend stocks that had compounded silently over the years. The security parameters required multiple layers of authentication, including passphrases only a direct family member would possess. I watched the terminal log as the intruder successfully bypassed the first 2 security gates using my old anniversary date and the name of my childhood pet. Only one person on Earth besides me retained access to that highly specific biographical data. I routed the intrusion alert through my advanced tracking software to pinpoint the exact geographical origin of the digital breach. The geolocation program rapidly triangulated the incoming signal, bouncing across multiple local Chicago servers. The Internet Protocol address mapped directly to a luxury high-rise apartment complex located in the downtown financial district. The service provider registration matched the specific unit currently leased by Connor. The reality of the situation crystallized with brutal and unforgiving clarity. My son was actively participating in a major cybercrime to rob his own father. He was attempting to liquidate my protective trust fund to save his mother from the immediate legal consequences of her disastrous new marriage. He chose absolute loyalty to a fraudulent venture capitalist over the man who had quietly shielded him from total ruin his entire adult life. The final security barrier on the New York account required a physical, notarized signature to authorize any external wire transfers. The digital access log showed Connor downloading the blank authorization forms directly to his local hard drive. I leaned back in my wooden chair, fully comprehending the severe legal threshold he was about to cross. He was actively preparing to commit federal wire fraud and systemic identity theft to appease a man who openly despised him. The penalty for forging a financial instrument of this magnitude carried mandatory federal prison time. I monitored the tracking screen as the document download completed successfully. I initiated a direct encrypted communication protocol to my corporate attorney in Chicago, instructing him to prepare the final stages of our legal trap. The bait had been taken, and the predators were firmly locked inside the digital cage. The silent adjustment required complete and utter destruction of their false reality to permanently correct the balance of power. The panoramic view of the Chicago skyline from the penthouse apartment usually provided Connor with a profound sense of superiority. Tonight, the glittering city lights offered absolutely no comfort. Connor paced the length of his expansive living room, allowing his expensive leather shoes to sink into the thick carpet. Sweat beaded on his forehead and stained the collar of his custom-tailored dress shirt. The ambient temperature in the room was perfectly controlled, yet he felt as though he were actively suffocating. Sterling stood near the marble kitchen island, casting a heavy and oppressive shadow over the luxurious space. The venture capitalist had lost all the refined charm he had displayed at the wedding reception hours earlier. His designer tuxedo jacket was discarded. His silk tie hung loose and his eyes darted around the room with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. Sterling was aggressively pushing a narrative of mutual survival, weaving a web of panic and manipulation that Connor was entirely too eager to believe. Sterling spoke in a low and urgent hiss. He insisted that the sudden freezing of his massive assets was merely a temporary and malicious glitch caused by unseen corporate rivals. He painted Patricia as the ultimate victim, portraying her as a fragile woman who was about to be thrown onto the street because of an administrative banking error. Sterling knew exactly which psychological buttons to push to ensure compliance. He pivoted seamlessly from Patricia's impending homelessness to Connor's own highly precarious financial reality. He reminded his stepson of the massive loans securing this very penthouse, the leased European sports cars in the garage, and the elite country club memberships that required exorbitant monthly dues. Sterling explicitly warned that if his venture firm collapsed tonight, the lucrative consulting retainers he had promised Connor would instantly vanish forever. The entire financial house of cards they had both built was teetering on the edge of a violent collapse. The only available solution, Sterling insisted, was the dormant family trust fund Vincent had established decades ago in New York. Megan stood near the hallway with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Connor's wife had listened to this escalating madness for the past 30 minutes, allowing her expression to transition from shock to absolute horror. She stepped forward deliberately, placing herself between Connor and the computer terminal. Her voice was sharp and remarkably clear, cutting directly through Sterling's frantic monologue. She explicitly told Connor that what they were actively discussing was not a simple financial maneuver or a creative accounting trick. It was a severe and premeditated federal crime. She outlined the stark reality of the situation, stating that accessing an encrypted trust fund without proper authorization constituted systemic wire fraud. She reminded him that federal prosecutors did not care about lifestyle maintenance or temporary liquidity crises. They cared about unauthorized digital access and stolen capital. She looked directly into Connor's eyes, pleading with him to recognize the total insanity of sacrificing his personal freedom for a man who had been a part of their family for less than 24 hours. Connor stopped pacing and turned toward his wife. Instead of seeing the logical truth in her desperate warning, he perceived her as an immediate obstacle. The toxic entitlement he had inherited from his mother completely blinded him to the severe legal jeopardy he was actively inviting into his life. He aggressively dismissed Megan's valid concerns, labeling her as dramatic and fundamentally unsupportive. He claimed she simply did not understand how high-level corporate finance operated in the real world. He argued that the trust fund money rightfully belonged to his family, rationalizing the impending theft as an early inheritance advance. He vehemently declared his absolute loyalty to his mother, insisting he could never abandon Patricia in her darkest hour. He consciously chose the glittering illusion of Sterling's fabricated wealth over the harsh and honest reality Megan was desperately trying to show him. He physically bypassed his wife, stepping around her to sit at the heavy oak desk where his computer monitor glowed in the dim lighting. Sterling immediately moved to stand directly over Connor's shoulder, acting as a silent enforcer, ensuring the illegal task was completed. Connor launched the secure banking application, allowing his fingers to tremble slightly as they hovered over the mechanical keyboard. He navigated to the legacy portal of the New York financial institution. The login screen demanded a series of complex security verifications to proceed. Connor utilized his deep and intimate knowledge of his father's past to bypass the initial security barriers. He successfully entered Vincent's old anniversary date and the specific maiden name of Vincent's paternal grandmother. The digital gates opened one by one, validating Connor's unauthorized entry into the system. The screen populated with the current balance of the dormant trust. The figures displayed were staggering, representing decades of quiet and aggressive compound interest. Sterling let out a sharp breath of vindication, hungrily staring at the digital numbers as if they could instantly cure his massive corporate debt. Connor initiated the prompt for an emergency external wire transfer. He inputted the routing numbers Sterling hurriedly provided, directing the massive sum toward an offshore account designed to immediately absorb and distribute the stolen capital. He clicked the final execution command, anticipating the relieving confirmation screen. Instead, the portal flashed a bright and solid red warning banner across the monitor. The banking system engaged a hard block on the transaction. The text on the screen clearly stated that any outgoing transfer exceeding a specific financial threshold required secondary biometric validation. Due to the advanced age and classification of the trust, the digital system demanded a physical, manually notarized signature from the primary account holder to authorize the massive movement of funds. The digital bypass was entirely insufficient. The bank required Vincent's actual handwriting, verified by a licensed state official, before a single dollar could be officially released. Connor slumped back in the heavy leather desk chair, allowing a profound sense of defeat to wash over his features. He stared at the red warning banner, realizing the insurmountable barrier it represented. He turned to Sterling, explicitly stating that the transaction was technically impossible. He admitted they could not force a wire transfer without his father physically signing a release document. Sterling did not exhibit any signs of panic. Instead, he reached into the interior pocket of his discarded tuxedo jacket and retrieved a perfectly folded and crisp legal document. He smoothed the paper flat against the surface of the oak desk, right next to the glowing keyboard. It was a blank wire transfer authorization form fully equipped with a fraudulent notary stamp already pressed securely into the bottom corner. Sterling reached into his pocket again, producing a high-quality fountain pen. He laid the writing instrument deliberately on top of the document. Sterling's voice dropped to a cold and commanding register. He instructed Connor to pull up an old digital file containing Vincent's signature from the local archives. He explicitly ordered Connor to trace his father's handwriting onto the forged authorization form with absolute perfection. He stated that the corrupt notary public they had secured would officially log the document the following morning, creating an airtight and legally binding paper trail that would completely satisfy the New York bank. He placed his hands firmly on the back of Connor's chair, trapping him at the desk, demanding he commit entirely to the felony. Connor stared at the blank line, waiting for his father's name. His breathing grew incredibly shallow as he recognized the definitive point of no return. He slowly reached forward and wrapped his fingers around the heavy metal barrel of the fountain pen. Megan watched this entire sequence unfold from the dark shadows of the hallway. She saw the exact moment her husband completely abandoned his moral compass. She did not scream or throw objects or engage in a futile emotional argument. She clearly recognized that the man sitting at the desk was entirely consumed by the toxic environment his mother and Sterling had successfully created. She turned around and walked silently into the master bedroom. She pulled a large travel suitcase from the top shelf of the custom closet. Moving with quiet and methodical precision, she packed her essential clothing, important documents, and personal valuables. She zipped the suitcase shut, allowing the mechanical sound to be completely masked by Sterling's ongoing verbal instructions in the other room. She walked back down the hallway, gripping the extendable handle of her luggage tightly. She did not stop to look at Connor as she passed the home office. She simply opened the heavy front door of the penthouse and walked out into the corridor, letting the door click firmly shut behind her. Connor did not look up from the desk. He pressed the nib of the fountain pen against the forged paper, carefully beginning to trace the first sharp curve of his father's stolen identity. The twin engines of the private aircraft roared with a muted mechanical precision as the jet tore through the freezing night sky high above the dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The cabin interior was a luxurious cocoon of silent pressurized air, polished walnut paneling, and ambient lighting. I sat alone in a wide leather armchair, staring at the digital flight tracker mapping my rapid descent toward the sprawling grid of Chicago. There were no hovering flight attendants offering champagne and no extravagant catering spreads to distract my focus. The aircraft belonged to a highly obscure subsidiary holding company buried 3 layers deep inside my complex corporate structure, rendering my transatlantic journey entirely invisible to public aviation databases or border tracking systems. Patricia and Connor firmly believed I was permanently exiled in Portugal, counting my remaining pennies just to afford my next meager meal. In reality, I was crossing the globe in a $60 million private jet, moving with the absolute silent precision of an apex predator closing in on its wounded prey. The heavy landing gear touched down on a desolate private airstrip located miles away from the bustling commercial terminals just before dawn. A black armored sedan waited idling on the damp tarmac with its headlights cutting through the early morning fog. I bypassed standard customs protocols through a prearranged corporate security channel and slipped into the pristine leather back seat of the waiting vehicle. The driver did not utter a single word of greeting. He simply navigated the empty suburban highways, guiding us smoothly toward the towering steel and glass canyons of the downtown financial district. The city that had callously stripped me of my family and my home was about to become the primary theater for my ultimate retribution. The armored sedan descended deep into a subterranean parking garage located beneath a massive, brutalist skyscraper. A secure private elevator carried me directly to the 42nd floor, completely bypassing the marble reception lobby and any potential security cameras. The heavy metal doors slid open to reveal a sterile, windowless boardroom. The expansive space was deliberately designed to eliminate any sense of time, weather, or geographical location, ensuring absolute mental focus on the brutal mechanics of high-level litigation and corporate dismemberment. Sitting silently at the far end of the massive mahogany conference table was Sullivan. He was a ruthless and highly effective corporate attorney who specialized in executing hostile financial warfare on my behalf. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit and possessed the cold, calculating eyes of a seasoned executioner who never lost a negotiation. We did not exchange hollow pleasantries or shake hands. Sullivan simply pushed a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the polished wood surface. He folded his hands perfectly together and delivered his preliminary situation report with chilling clinical detachment. The advanced digital tripwires I had previously established around the New York Trust Fund had been thoroughly and systematically compromised. Sullivan confirmed that my son had successfully bypassed the initial security gates utilizing deeply personal biographical data that only a family member could possibly possess. The secondary biometric barrier, however, remained fully intact and unyielding. Connor had hit a digital concrete wall and was desperately searching for a physical analog workaround to execute the theft. Sullivan tapped a button on his sleek tablet computer, immediately illuminating a large flat-screen monitor securely mounted on the far wall of the boardroom. The high-definition display showed a crisp, scanned image of a blank wire transfer authorization form bearing the official corporate letterhead of my private New York banking institution. The document had been downloaded directly to the specific Internet Protocol address associated with Connor's luxury downtown penthouse just hours ago. Sullivan leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the mahogany table. He explained in a low, steady voice that Sterling was actively and aggressively manipulating my son into committing systemic identity theft. They were actively preparing to manually forge my physical signature onto the authorization form in a frantic attempt to bypass the bank's digital blockade. I stared at the blank signature line glowing brightly on the monitor. A profound and heavy silence filled the windowless room, pressing against my eardrums. I was watching my only biological child willfully choose to cross a terrifying moral and federal legal threshold. He was entirely willing to steal his own future inheritance simply to bail out a fraudulent and abusive venture capitalist who openly despised our family name. There was absolutely no trace of paternal anger left burning in my chest. The betrayal was so absolute, so pathetic, and so fundamentally weak that it completely extinguished any lingering affection I held for the boy I had raised. I felt only a cold, clinical resolve to step aside and let the natural, devastating consequences of his own criminal actions crush him. Sullivan reached for his encrypted cellular phone, assuming I wanted him to dispatch federal law enforcement authorities to the penthouse immediately. He stated with absolute confidence that we possessed enough digital surveillance evidence to have both Connor and Sterling arrested for attempted wire fraud before the sun fully rose over Lake Michigan. I raised a single hand, commanding him to stop the call. I explicitly instructed him to leave the police entirely out of this equation for the time being. Attempted wire fraud was a minor preliminary charge that a clever defense attorney could potentially negotiate down to probation or a simple fine. I required absolute and irreversible destruction. I ordered Sullivan to completely ignore the trust fund forgery for the moment and focus his entire legal team on Sterling's rapidly collapsing corporate portfolio. The public humiliation at the lavish wedding reception had already sent massive shockwaves through the elite financial sector. Sterling's offshore lenders were currently in a state of absolute panic, desperate to liquidate his toxic debt before his venture firm officially imploded and filed for bankruptcy. I told Sullivan to deploy the anonymous holding firm immediately. I instructed him to contact every single one of Sterling's terrified creditors and offer to purchase his remaining commercial debt for pennies on the dollar. The panicked lending institutions would gladly accept a massive discount just to scrub their ledgers clean and avoid a total loss. By dawn, I wanted my invisible corporation to hold every single promissory note, every outstanding margin call, and every high-interest corporate loan Sterling had ever signed. I was orchestrating a massive shadow buyout to become his sole and absolute creditor. Sullivan paused momentarily to process the sheer magnitude and brutality of my financial strategy. He nodded in grim appreciation, recognizing the lethal brilliance of completely cornering the man financially before dropping the legal hammer. He then flipped to the final page of his extensive dossier and issued a stark, urgent warning regarding the impending forgery. His dedicated surveillance team had successfully intercepted a panicked digital communication between Sterling and a notorious underworld contact operating in the city. Sterling had scheduled a discreet off-the-books meeting with a deeply corrupt notary public for exactly 8:00 the following morning. This compromised state official was handsomely paid to legitimize entirely fraudulent documents with a state-sanctioned embossed seal. Sullivan warned that once my forged signature was officially notarized and electronically submitted to the New York bank, the crime would immediately escalate from a mere attempt to a fully executed and devastating federal felony. He strongly cautioned that allowing the fraudulent document to be officially processed carried significant institutional risk to the trust fund itself. I looked directly into Sullivan's eyes and allowed a slow smile to form on my face. The expression was entirely devoid of any warmth, humanity, or humor. I instructed my attorney to stand down immediately and let the morning meeting proceed without any interference. Let Connor sit at his desk and trace my handwriting. Let the corrupt official stamp the forged paper with his official seal. Let them confidently submit the fraudulent document directly to the federal financial institution. I wanted them to completely cement their own federal crime without any external pressure. I wanted the heavy steel door of the penitentiary to lock firmly behind them by their own deliberate hands. The trap was now perfectly set, and the oblivious prey was eagerly rushing toward the fatal bait. The morning air in the city was biting and bitter, offering a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat radiating inside the sleek, glass-walled interior of the downtown financial institution. Sterling pushed through the heavy revolving doors with the aggressive and entitled stride of a man who believed he owned the entire building. He wore a fresh designer suit, projecting the immaculate illusion of a highly successful venture capitalist simply conducting a routine morning business transaction. Connor trailed a step behind him, carrying a slim leather briefcase that felt significantly heavier than a block of solid lead. The freshly forged trust document burned like a radioactive ember against the dark leather lining. Connor kept his eyes glued to the polished marble floor, terrified that the high-definition security cameras tracking their every move could somehow read the immense guilt radiating from his sweating face. He had officially crossed a permanent line. He was no longer just a failing businessman, relying on his mother's swoosh for constant handouts to maintain his lifestyle. He was now an active and willing participant in a major federal felony. Sterling remained completely oblivious to his stepson's mental collapse. He confidently navigated the expansive corporate lobby, stepping directly toward the high-net-worth client services desk. The air inside the bank smelled of expensive cologne and ozone, actively masking the distinct stench of their mutual financial desperation. They approached a senior teller stationed behind a thick pane of pristine bulletproof glass. Sterling leaned casually against the marble counter, flashing a brilliant and highly practiced smile that completely hid the catastrophic financial ruin lurking just hours away in his immediate future. He announced in a smooth voice that they needed to execute an expedited domestic and international wire transfer. Connor reached out and unlatched the heavy brass clasps of the briefcase. His hands shook violently as he pulled out the forged authorization form. The signature at the bottom, perfectly traced from his father's old personal files, mocked him from the page. He slid the crisp paper under the narrow security partition. Sterling took absolute command of the conversation, speaking in a low and authoritative register designed to prevent any further questioning. He instructed the teller to initiate an immediate and irreversible transfer of $500,000 from the Legacy Family Trust, routing it directly into a specific offshore corporate account. He heavily emphasized the word immediate, attempting to mask his rising internal panic with manufactured executive impatience. The teller was a professional woman with decades of experience handling massive fortunes. She offered a polite nod, taking the document, and carefully examining the freshly stamped notary seal before turning toward her secure terminal. Connor held his breath, desperately praying the transaction would process smoothly so he could walk out of the building and pretend this massive crime never happened. The teller typed the specific routing numbers into her secure banking database. She placed the forged document flat onto the glass scanner to authenticate the transaction against the bank's internal security records. The scanner flashed a bright white light, instantly digitizing the fake signature for biometric verification. Connor watched her monitor reflect against her framed glasses. The standard blue banking interface suddenly vanished, replaced by a glaring and solid red warning screen. The teller stopped typing instantly. Her polite customer service smile faded into a mask of rigid corporate protocol. She did not look back at Sterling or Connor. Instead, she picked up her desk phone and dialed a short internal security extension, whispering a few inaudible words, while keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the red warning banner. Sterling tapped his manicured fingers impatiently against the marble counter. He demanded to know what was taking so long, adopting the abrasive tone of an offended billionaire who was being severely inconvenienced by the working class. The teller placed the phone back on the receiver and offered an incredibly tense apology. She stated that transactions of this specific magnitude required secondary executive authorization and politely asked them to wait just a moment. She then stepped away from the window, taking the physical forged document with her. Connor felt the blood drain completely from his face. His stomach twisted into violent and painful knots. The lingering hope of a clean getaway evaporated entirely, replaced by the crushing and absolute weight of impending doom. The heavy oak door located behind the teller stations clicked open loudly. A senior bank manager walked out into the main service area. He was a tall, imposing figure with silver hair projecting absolute financial authority. He was not smiling, and he did not offer a greeting. More alarming than his physical presence were the two armed and uniformed security officers flanking him closely on either side. They moved with deliberate tactical precision, fanning out slightly, as the manager approached the bulletproof glass. The entire atmosphere of the bank shifted instantly from quiet luxury to a hostile and active standoff. Sterling stood up straight, losing his casual posture. He aggressively demanded to know why armed security was being involved in a simple family trust withdrawal. The manager did not flinch or offer an apology. He looked directly at Sterling and then shifted his cold gaze to Connor. He slid the forged document back through the security slot, rejecting it entirely. The manager spoke with absolute clarity, informing them that the transaction was legally impossible to execute. He stated that the specific trust fund they were attempting to access had been completely frozen exactly 24 hours ago. He revealed the shocking truth that the primary beneficiary of the account was no longer the original owner, but rather an anonymous corporate holding firm that had enacted an impenetrable legal lockdown on every single penny within the portfolio. The devastating words hung in the air, slowly dismantling Sterling's entire fabricated reality. He stared at the manager in sheer disbelief. The wealthy billionaire mask violently shattered. Sterling erupted in a sudden and explosive rage. He slammed his closed fists repeatedly against the hard marble counter, his face turning a dark shade of crimson. He screamed that there had to be a catastrophic banking mistake, shouting that he was a powerful venture capitalist and they were illegally holding his family's rightful money hostage. He threatened massive lawsuits demanding to speak to the bank president immediately, while his voice echoed loudly across the silent lobby. Other patrons stopped their business and stared at the man, completely losing his mind over a frozen account. Connor did not move a single muscle. He did not speak a word. He felt as though he were trapped in a terrifying vacuum. The horrific reality of his situation finally crushed him. The money was completely untouchable. The unknown holding firm already controlled the vast assets. He had committed severe documentable federal wire fraud and systemic identity theft for absolutely nothing. He had manually forged his father's signature and handed the physical proof of his federal crime directly to a banking institution. He was going to federal prison, and he had done it willingly. The bank manager completely ignored Sterling's chaotic and embarrassing tantrum. He remained perfectly still, waiting patiently for the desperate screaming to subside. When Sterling finally paused to catch his breath, panting heavily against the glass partition, the manager reached into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, sealed legal envelope and slid it through the transaction slot, pushing it directly toward the exhausted venture capitalist. He stated that the bank was legally obligated to serve this official legal notice on behalf of their new primary corporate client. Sterling ripped the thick envelope open with violently shaking hands. His panicked eyes scanned the formal legal jargon printed on the premium paper. The document was a devastating financial execution. It was a formal declaration stating that all of Sterling's outstanding commercial debts, his risky bridge loans, and his highly leveraged personal assets had been aggressively purchased by the exact same anonymous holding firm that now controlled the trust. The legal notice demanded immediate payment in full for every single massive liability. The new and entirely unknown creditor had officially called in all his debts simultaneously. Sterling was completely and utterly bankrupted. He dropped the heavy paper onto the floor, staring blankly at the marble tiles. The invisible trap had closed around them with absolute merciless precision, leaving them standing alone in the total wreckage of their own criminal arrogance. The interior of the luxury sedan felt like a pressurized cabin as Connor navigated the slick Chicago streets under the cover of darkness. Sterling sat in the passenger seat, radiating a frantic feral energy that completely contradicted his tailored designer suit. He repeatedly dragged his hands through his manicured hair, muttering about federal audits and liquid capital. The bank manager had explicitly shut down their digital avenue, leaving Sterling entirely cornered by the massive debt calling his name. He turned to Connor with wide, desperate eyes and insisted that the digital freeze could only be overridden by the original physical deed to the trust fund. Sterling claimed that banking regulations required them to honor wet ink on official parchment over any automated system block. He aggressively manipulated the narrative, insisting that obtaining this document was the absolute only way to save Patricia from total social and financial ruin. Connor gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, letting the guilt of his previous actions wash over him, but he remained hopelessly tethered to his mother's new husband. He capitulated to the demands and turned the vehicle toward the industrial district. The downtown storage facility loomed at the end of a deserted street surrounded by chain-link fences and cracked asphalt. It was a bleak concrete fortress where Vincent had stored the remnants of their family history after moving overseas. Connor parked the car in the shadows of a broken street lamp, killing the engine to preserve their silence. The freezing wind bit through their thin formal clothing as they approached the towering metal security gate. Sterling paced nervously, looking over his shoulder for any signs of security patrols while demanding Connor hurry up. Connor stepped up to the glowing keypad, shivering as he stared at the worn numerical buttons. He closed his eyes and relied on his childhood memory, recalling the specific combination of digits his father had used for every secure lock in their old suburban home. He punched in his own birth date, followed by the year his parents were married. The heavy mechanical gears inside the gate groaned to life, and the metal barrier slowly slid open, granting them unauthorized entry into the silent compound. They moved swiftly down the long, dimly lit corridors, listening to the hollow echo of their dress shoes, slapping against the bare concrete floor. The air inside the building smelled of old dust and industrial solvent. They bypassed dozens of identical orange metal doors until they reached the specific unit registered under Vincent's name. Sterling did not waste a single second attempting to find a subtle point of entry. He reached into the duffel bag he had retrieved from the car trunk and pulled out a heavy steel crowbar. He shoved Connor aside and wedged the flattened end of the iron tool deep into the gap between the padlock and the metal hasp. Sterling threw his entire body weight against the crowbar, grunting with severe physical exertion as the metal began to bend and shriek under the immense pressure. The padlock violently snapped off its hinges, clattering loudly against the concrete floor. Sterling kicked the corrugated metal door upward, sending it crashing into its overhead housing. Connor stepped into the dark storage locker completely unprepared for the emotional weight of what lay inside. The small space was packed from floor to ceiling, with carefully labeled cardboard boxes, sealed plastic bins, and old pieces of furniture. Sterling immediately pushed past him, acting like a starving animal searching for food. He began ripping the lids off the plastic bins and violently overturning the heavy cardboard boxes. Decades of meticulously preserved family history spilled out onto the dirty floor. Sterling carelessly trampled over pristine photo albums containing childhood pictures of Connor learning to ride a bicycle. He kicked aside hand-painted ornaments Patricia had crafted during the early years of their marriage. Connor watched in stunned silence as the remnants of his father's quiet love were desecrated in a matter of seconds. Sterling threw a box of antique pocket watches against the concrete wall, shattering the delicate glass faces simply because the documents were not inside. He ordered Connor to stop staring and start tearing through the bottom layers of the storage unit. Connor mechanically dropped to his knees, pulling apart his own childhood memories in a desperate search for the legal salvation they required. Beneath a pile of old winter coats and mothballed blankets, Sterling finally struck something solid. He frantically cleared the heavy fabric away, revealing a thick steel lockbox bolted to the wooden pallet resting on the floor. It was a vintage heavy-duty safe designed to withstand fires and extreme physical trauma. Sterling let out a breathless gasp of pure victory, completely convinced the original trust documents were secured inside the metal vault. He did not bother asking for a combination. He raised the steel crowbar high above his head and brought it down with devastating force against the dial. The loud metallic crack echoed down the empty corridor. He struck the safe again and again, allowing his desperate rage to fuel his physical strength. The heavy metal dial eventually buckled and caved inward, destroying the locking mechanism entirely. Sterling dropped the bent crowbar and dropped to his knees, tearing at his fingernails as he pried the thick steel door open. Connor held his breath, leaning forward to catch a glimpse of the financial documents that would save his newly adopted lifestyle. Sterling ripped the heavy door wide open and plunged his hands into the dark cavity of the safe. The venture capitalist froze entirely motionless. The manic energy instantly drained from his body, replaced by a profound and chilling stillness. Connor pushed closer, peering over his stepfather's slumped shoulder. The interior of the massive steel safe was completely empty. There were no manila envelopes, no bound legal folders, no stock certificates, and absolutely no physical deed to the family trust. The bottom of the metal box contained nothing but a single crisp rectangular object resting directly in the center. Sterling reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the item, holding it up to the dim overhead light. It was a freshly printed premium business card. The thick white cardstock bore the embossed gold logo of Sullivan's ruthless corporate law firm. There was no handwritten note and no taunting message. The presence of the pristine business card alone delivered a fatal psychological blow. It explicitly communicated that Vincent was not a naive old man living in the past, but a highly calculated predator who remained 10 steps ahead of their every move. Connor stared blankly at the embossed gold lettering on the business card, feeling a cold wave of nausea wash over him. The sharp reality of his father's immense intelligence finally pierced through the fog of Sterling's constant manipulation. He realized with absolute clarity that every single action they had taken over the past 24 hours had been carefully anticipated and expertly countered. The forged document currently sitting in his briefcase, the desperate drive across the city, the violent destruction of his own childhood memories. It had all been a beautifully orchestrated performance directed by the very man they had sought to ruin. Sterling slowly lowered the business card, letting it flutter down to rest among the scattered and broken remnants of the family he was trying to steal from. He stared at his trembling hands, unable to process the absolute totality of his defeat. He had leveraged millions forged documents and exposed himself to federal prison simply to chase a ghost. Miles away in the sterile, windowless boardroom hidden within the Chicago financial district, a silent digital alarm triggered on a sophisticated monitoring terminal. Vincent sat perfectly still at the head of the mahogany conference table, watching a blinking green icon illuminate on the secure tracking software. The proprietary security sensors he had covertly installed on the hinges of the downtown storage unit confirmed an unauthorized physical breach had just occurred. He took a slow, measured sip of his dark espresso, feeling the rich warmth slide down his throat. His ruthless corporate attorney Sullivan sat across the table reviewing a thick stack of commercial debt acquisitions. Vincent did not need to view security footage to know exactly what was happening inside that dark concrete room. He knew his son had just witnessed the absolute destruction of his father's memories, only to find an empty void. He knew Sterling was currently staring at the business card, realizing his entire existence was now firmly trapped within a legal and financial cage. Vincent placed his porcelain cup down onto its saucer, creating a soft but definitive click in the quiet boardroom. He did not feel a sense of triumphant vindication. He merely recognized the successful execution of a mathematical probability. Sullivan glanced up from his extensive legal paperwork, noting the green light flashing on the security monitor. He offered a brief professional nod, acknowledging that the physical bait had been consumed exactly as predicted. Vincent remained impassive, keeping his emotions locked away behind a fortress of calculated discipline. He allowed himself one brief moment to acknowledge the tragedy of his son's choices before burying the sentiment entirely. He instructed his attorney to prepare the final phase of their operation. The physical documents had proven to be a dead end for his adversaries, ensuring their next move would be one of absolute blind panic. They would undoubtedly attempt to secure their fraudulent notary stamp the following morning, cementing their federal crimes on public record. Vincent interlaced his fingers, resting them on the cool surface of the mahogany table, ready to watch the final pieces of their fragile lives crumble into dust. The sleek black surveillance van idled silently in the damp alleyway situated directly across from the industrial storage facility. Inside the heavily modified vehicle, a seasoned private investigator named Vance expertly adjusted the focal ring on a military-grade telephoto lens. The high-powered camera rested on a stabilized tripod, pointing straight through a narrow gap in the tinted rear window. Vance had spent the last 2 decades dismantling corporate espionage rings and tracking high-level embezzlers for Sullivan. This particular assignment felt almost insultingly easy compared to his usual operations. Through the high-definition viewfinder, he watched Sterling and Connor tear through the metal locker like desperate, starving scavengers. A highly sensitive parabolic microphone aimed directly at the open storage unit captured every ragged breath and frantic movement with pristine acoustic clarity. The live audio feed piped straight into Vance's noise, canceling headphones seamlessly, separating the harsh sounds of tearing cardboard and shattering glass from the low ambient hum of the sleeping Chicago night. The sensitive microphone picked up the heavy metallic thud of the steel lockbox hitting the concrete floor. Vance adjusted the gain on the audio receiver as Sterling completely lost his mind. The venture capitalist stood amidst the total wreckage of Vincent's family history, breathing heavily while his expensive designer suit was covered in decades of accumulated gray dust. Sterling turned his feral and unhinged gaze directly toward Connor. The carefully cultivated facade of the wealthy and benevolent stepfather vanished entirely, replaced by the vicious snarl of a cornered predator. Sterling pointed a shaking, dust-covered finger at the younger man and unleashed a torrent of venomous abuse. He screamed that Connor was nothing but a useless, arrogant pawn in a high-stakes game he lacked the basic intellect to comprehend. The audio recorder captured the raw, unfiltered desperation in Sterling's voice as he paced the concrete floor, like a caged animal, making a fatal and irreversible admission. He explicitly stated he had never possessed a single ounce of genuine affection for Patricia. He detailed with cruel precision how he had barely endured her suffocating vanity and her endless, desperate social climbing solely to gain proximity to the massive wealth he firmly believed Vincent had left behind. He openly admitted the entire glamorous marriage was nothing more than a calculated acquisition strategy designed to salvage his own rapidly sinking venture firm and plug the massive holes in his fraudulent balance sheets. Connor absorbed the brutal verbal assault while standing perfectly still, his hands hanging limply at his sides. The sudden revelation of his mother's sham marriage and his own pathetic status as a disposable tool finally pierced his thick shield of unearned arrogance. Instead of shrinking away in shame, Connor lashed out with a sudden and highly defensive rage. He shouted back at Sterling, his voice echoing sharply off the cold concrete walls of the abandoned storage facility. He aggressively reminded the older man of the massive legal risks he had personally assumed to clean up this catastrophic mess. Connor clearly and unambiguously articulated his own specific criminal actions. He yelled that he had meticulously forged the notary stamps and falsified the official signatures on the trust transfer documents with his own hands. He demanded immediate respect and recognition for committing federal wire fraud to save Sterling's hollow, crumbling empire. The parabolic microphone recorded every single desperate syllable of the loud confession, capturing the exact moment Connor legally sealed his own fate, without a shadow of a doubt. Vance tapped the mechanical keyboard of his encrypted laptop, swiftly saving the pristine audio and video feeds. He quickly prepared the heavy data packets for immediate and secure dispatch. He meticulously separated the high-definition surveillance footage and the isolated audio tracks into 2 highly secure compressed folders. To maintain the strict and required cataloging system mandated by Sullivan's law firm, he labeled the primary video evidence containing the break-in and Sterling's psychological breakdown as Kich Ban Ong Daden Mao Mot Gach, Dui Mui Cham Dok X in the digital registry. He then categorized the secondary audio file capturing Connor's explicit and undeniable confession of forgery as Kich Ban Ong Daden Hai Gach, Dui Mui Cham Dok X before initiating the final secure transfer protocol. The blue progress bar zipped across the glowing screen, routing the encrypted files through a complex series of anonymous offshore servers until they landed directly on the secure terminal located in Sullivan's downtown boardroom. Miles away in the sterile, windowless 42nd floor conference room, the large flat-screen wall monitor softly chimed. Vincent sat entirely motionless at the head of the heavy mahogany table. Sullivan navigated the incoming transmission, deliberately opening the designated evidence files. The crisp, high-definition video feed filled the large screen, illuminating the dark boardroom with the grim reality of the ransacked storage unit. Vincent watched his biological son and his ex-wife's fraudulent new husband physically desecrate his carefully preserved past. He listened intently through the high-fidelity surround sound speakers as Sterling loudly confessed his fake marriage and detailed his parasitic financial intentions. Vincent's facial expression remained entirely locked behind an impenetrable mask of absolute stoicism. There were no tears of sorrow and absolutely no sighs of paternal disappointment. He simply watched Connor step aggressively into the camera frame and loudly admit to forging the highly secure legal documents. Vincent observed the cold sweat on his son's forehead and the desperate, pathetic panic swimming in his eyes. The fundamental biological bond connecting them severed completely and permanently in that quiet room. Vincent no longer saw a misguided son corrupted by a toxic and greedy mother. He saw a fully willing criminal actively participating in a malicious conspiracy to destroy him. Sullivan paused the digital playback, freezing the sharp image of Connor screaming in the dark concrete storage locker. The ruthless corporate attorney looked across the polished table, silently awaiting his next set of instructions. Vincent leaned back in the heavy leather chair, calmly processing the definitive and undeniable evidence of their absolute guilt. The elaborate trap had functioned with flawless and terrifying mathematical precision. Connor and Sterling had not only eagerly consumed the poisoned bait, but had willingly provided a perfectly recorded confession detailing their exact criminal methodology. Vincent smoothly interlaced his fingers, resting them lightly on the table. He turned his cold, unfeeling gaze toward Sullivan and issued the final, devastating directive. He instructed the attorney to immediately initiate the terminal phase of their aggressive legal strategy. Vincent ordered Sullivan to completely dismantle the very foundation of their fabricated reality. He demanded the immediate unsealing of the massive debt acquisition records and the simultaneous deployment of brutal eviction notices for every single luxury property Sterling and Connor currently occupied. He wanted their banking accounts instantly locked, their credit lines permanently severed, and the forged documents officially handed over to the federal prosecutor's office before the sun came up. The time for quiet observation and silent maneuvering had officially concluded. Vincent was fully ready to drop the entire crushing weight of the federal legal system directly onto their heads, completely and permanently erasing their existence from the elite world they had tried so desperately to steal. The morning sunlight filtered gracefully through the heavy silk drapes of the master bedroom, casting a warm and expensive glow over the imported Italian furniture. Patricia lay peacefully beneath the high thread count sheets, fully expecting another predictable day filled with elite country club luncheons and exclusive private spa appointments. The quiet serenity of the affluent suburban neighborhood was suddenly shattered by a violent and relentless hammering sound echoing from the ground floor. It was not the polite and deferential knock of a private courier or a wealthy neighbor dropping by for a morning visit. The noise was heavy, authoritative, and distinctly aggressive, violently vibrating the solid oak structure of the custom front door. Patricia threw off the heavy duvet, wrapping herself tightly in a plush cashmere robe. She hurried down the sweeping grand staircase, feeling a sharp spike of genuine irritation at the unprecedented disturbance. She pulled the brass handle open, fully prepared to deliver a scathing reprimand to whoever was making such an obnoxious racket on her pristine front porch. Two uniformed county sheriffs stood firmly on the welcome mat. Their facial expressions were entirely devoid of any warmth, hesitation, or societal deference. They flanked the grand entrance, projecting an immovable and terrifying wall of absolute legal authority. The taller officer stepped forward, deliberately breaking the threshold of her immaculate marble foyer without asking for permission to enter the residence. The sheriff extended a thick stack of official legal documents printed on harsh yellow paper. He formally addressed her by her full legal name, announcing in a loud and booming voice that they were executing an expedited eviction order on behalf of the county court. Patricia stared blankly at the thick bundle of papers, refusing to reach out and take them from his outstretched hand. She demanded an immediate explanation, insisting with mounting hysteria that there must be a catastrophic clerical error in their municipal database. She loudly proclaimed her status, arguing she was legally married to a billionaire venture capitalist, and that this sprawling estate was completely secure. The officer did not entertain her frantic protests. He forcefully pressed the heavy legal documents directly into her trembling hands. He stated with absolute clinical clarity that the property had been completely foreclosed upon by the primary commercial note holder. He explained that an unauthorized secondary bridge loan had triggered an immediate and severe default clause within the original mortgage covenant. This specific violation legally allowed the anonymous corporate holding firm to seize the massive asset immediately, without any further judicial review. The complex legal language densely printed on the front page was undeniable and devastating. Sterling had recklessly used her secure sanctuary as collateral for a high-yield cash infusion and had completely defaulted on the aggressive repayment terms. The invisible holding firm was now actively executing their absolute legal right to clear the premises and take physical possession of the property. The sheriffs coldly informed her she had exactly 1 hour to gather a single small bag of personal necessities before they permanently padlocked the heavy oak doors and formally condemned the estate. A loud mechanical grinding noise suddenly erupted from the circular gravel driveway outside. Patricia pushed frantically past the armed officers, stepping out onto the cold brick porch in her bare feet. 2 heavy-duty commercial tow trucks equipped with flashing yellow hazard lights were actively maneuvering into position directly behind Sterling's leased European sports cars. The burly operators moved with practiced and ruthless efficiency, attaching thick steel chains to the front axles of the gleaming luxury vehicles. Patricia screamed at the men, ordering them to stop their actions immediately. She wildly threatened to call the police, completely forgetting that armed municipal law enforcement was currently standing right behind her shoulder. The tow truck operators ignored her frantic commands, entirely treating her like an invisible ghost. They engaged the loud hydraulic winches, dragging the expensive, sleek cars up onto the steel flatbeds with a deafening and violent metallic screech. The tangible physical symbols of her fabricated wealth were being aggressively stripped away in broad daylight for the entire affluent neighborhood to witness. Several neighbors had already stepped out onto their manicured lawns, watching the spectacular financial destruction unfold with silent, judging eyes. The harsh reality of her sudden and absolute poverty hit Patricia with the devastating force of a physical blow. The secure safety net she firmly believed she had locked down through her deceitful marriage to Sterling had completely evaporated into thin air. She ran back inside the house, abandoning all remaining pride as she snatched her cellular phone from the marble entryway table. She frantically tapped Sterling's contact icon, praying desperately for his smooth, reassuring voice to somehow fix this escalating nightmare. The cellular line rang exactly 1 time before dropping straight into a generic automated voicemail inbox. She dialed his number again and again, gripping the fragile device until her manicured knuckles turned completely white. The result was exactly the same every single time. Sterling had completely vanished from the grid. He had cowardly abandoned her to face the brutal and public consequences of his catastrophic financial ruin entirely alone. The rising panic rapidly mutated into a pure and primal survival instinct. She immediately scrolled through her contacts and dialed Connor, requiring her biological son to rescue her from this impending homelessness. Connor answered the phone on the 5th agonizing ring. His voice was not the confident tone of a young corporate executive. It was a harsh, raspy whisper echoing inside a tiny hollow room. He quickly explained he was not sitting in his luxury downtown penthouse. He was currently hiding inside a cheap cash-only roadside motel located on the industrial outskirts of the city. He sounded absolutely terrified, his words tumbling out in a rapid, panicked stream of consciousness. Connor told his mother that Sterling was a complete fraud and a dangerous manipulator. He explicitly stated that the venture capitalist had forced him to commit a massive federal crime against his own father. Connor detailed the absolute failure at the bank, explaining that the family trust was completely frozen by a hostile corporate entity. He yelled into the phone that he had actively forged notarized documents and handed them directly to a bank manager. He was currently destroying his mobile SIM cards and waiting for the Federal Bureau of Investigation to kick down his motel door. He explicitly told Patricia he was facing decades in federal prison for systemic wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He aggressively stated he had absolutely no liquid money, no hidden resources, and no physical ability to help her. He warned her to stay away from him before abruptly terminating the call, leaving her listening to the dead digital tone. Patricia stood completely frozen in the center of her sprawling and suddenly empty foyer. The armed sheriffs remained firmly positioned by the front door, silently checking their watches as they counted down the minutes until her forced and highly public departure. She had zero financial options remaining on the board. Her wealthy country club friends would instantly abandon her the very second news of this humiliating eviction spread through their elite social circles. Her fraudulent husband had fled the state, and her biological son was a wanted fugitive hiding in a dirty motel room waiting to be arrested. Her mind raced frantically through the dark corners of her manipulative arsenal, searching for a single viable target to exploit. There was only one man left on the planet who possessed the immense liquid resources necessary to reverse this total destruction and provide her with a secure sanctuary. She opened a new text message addressed directly to Vincent. She knew a simple plea for financial mercy or a genuine apology would be completely ignored by his cold, calculating logic. She needed a weaponized emotional hook to bypass his formidable defensive barriers. Patricia typed out a frantic and highly fabricated story, claiming she was currently sitting in the cardiac ward of the city hospital. She detailed a sudden life-threatening medical collapse involving a severe stress-induced heart attack. She begged him for a rapid face-to-face meeting, stating she needed to see him one last time to apologize for everything, before the doctors wheeled her into emergency open-heart surgery. She tapped the screen, sending the calculated lie into the digital ether, deploying her ultimate and final gambit to secure her own survival. The digital display of the encrypted cellular phone illuminated the dark mahogany table with a soft, bluish glow. Vincent stared at the incoming message from his former wife, reading the frantic blocks of text with the absolute clinical detachment of a forensic pathologist examining a corpse. Patricia claimed to be lying on a gurney in the cardiac intensive care unit, actively suffering from a massive stress-induced heart failure. She begged for his immediate presence, deploying a heavy layer of manufactured guilt and desperate nostalgia to hook his sympathies. The sheer audacity of her lie was entirely predictable. Vincent knew flawlessly that a woman experiencing a genuine myocardial infarction would not be composing perfectly structured paragraphs demanding a financial reconciliation. He recognized the text for exactly what it was. It was the desperate flailing of a drowning predator, completely stripped of her stolen assets and looking for a familiar raft to drag under the water. He did not feel a single tremor of pity or concern. He tapped a brief and accommodating reply onto the glass screen, projecting the exact persona of the gullible and forgiving man she desperately needed him to be. He agreed to see her immediately, providing a specific address in the heart of the downtown financial district, and instructed her to bring their son and her new husband to resolve their urgent family crisis. Miles away, standing barefoot on the cold marble floor of her foreclosed estate, Patricia gripped her phone as the confirmation tone chimed. A sharp gasp of triumphant relief escaped her throat. She genuinely believed her manipulative mastery remained entirely intact. She immediately shifted into a state of hyper-focused, tactical survival. She dialed the cheap roadside motel where Connor was currently hiding, ordering him to wash his face, put on a clean suit, and order a taxi to the city center. She refused to listen to his terrified stammering about federal agents or prison sentences. She sharply commanded him to pull himself together and prepare for the most important performance of his entire pathetic life. She then dialed Sterling, relying on the geographical tracking feature she had secretly installed on his mobile device months ago. She located his exact position, pacing aimlessly near a downtown coffee shop. She dispatched a rideshare vehicle to collect him, ignoring the bitter irony of a billionaire relying on budget transportation. She dressed herself rapidly in a modest dark dress, deliberately stripping away her heavy diamond jewelry and wiping off her vibrant makeup. She needed to look suitably devastated and physically exhausted to sell her fabricated medical trauma. She walked out the front door of the mansion without looking back, leaving the county sheriffs to padlock her former life away forever. The three of them converged on a busy downtown street corner, standing beneath the towering shadows of the surrounding corporate skyscrapers. The physical toll of the last 24 hours was painfully evident on the two men. Sterling looked entirely hollowed out, his designer tuxedo deeply wrinkled and stained with the gray concrete dust from his violent tantrum inside the storage facility. His face was covered in a slick sheen of anxious sweat, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a leather briefcase. Connor was in far worse condition physically, shaking his eyes, darting frantically at every passing police cruiser and security guard. He looked exactly like a guilty fugitive waiting for the inevitable heavy hand of the law to strike him down. Patricia immediately took absolute command of the pathetic group, pulling them into the dark recess of a narrow alleyway to coordinate their immediate offensive strategy. She spoke in sharp and rapid whispers, completely ignoring the fact that they were entirely responsible for their own destruction. She explicitly outlined the specific narrative they would feed to Vincent. She reminded them that her former husband was a weak and sentimental fool who had spent decades quietly absorbing her endless demands. She firmly believed he was currently living on a meager fixed income, entirely ignorant of high-level corporate finance. Her plan was to leverage his lingering paternal affection and extract whatever modest savings or retirement pensions he had managed to hide away. Sterling seized upon this desperate life raft with the aggressive delusion of a lifelong con artist. He grabbed Connor by the shoulders, digging his fingers deeply into the expensive fabric of the suit worn by the younger man. He locked eyes with his stepson and fed him his exact legal alibi. He commanded Connor to completely deny any active involvement in the trust fund breach. Sterling instructed him to claim his digital identity had been maliciously stolen by unseen hackers who had used his credentials to target his father. Connor nodded rapidly, swallowing the massive lie and desperately committing the false narrative to memory. Sterling then turned to Patricia, adjusting his ruined collar and smoothing his hair. He declared that once they drained Vincent of his last remaining dollars, he would use the liquid capital to hire a professional fixer and permanently flee the jurisdiction, leaving the massive debt trail to collapse on its own. They operated under the absolute and unshakable delusion that they were walking into a meeting with a broken and destitute old man. They failed entirely to comprehend the lethal reality that the address Vincent had provided belonged to one of the most powerful and ruthless corporate legal firms in the entire hemisphere. The trio marched out of the alleyway and approached the massive glass and steel facade of the designated building. The structure was a towering monument to institutional power dominating the city skyline with its sleek geometric angles. Patricia hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring at the imposing corporate logos etched into the polished granite entry pillars. The location did not fit her mental image of a cheap diner or a low-rent apartment building where she assumed Vincent currently resided. Sterling pushed past her hesitation, driven by a blind and arrogant hunger for survival. He arrogantly assumed Vincent was merely utilizing a public lobby, or a borrowed conference room to conduct his meager business. They pushed through the heavy revolving doors, entering a massive atrium lined with imported marble and patrolled by serious armed security personnel. Connor kept his head bowed low, terrified that the sophisticated facial recognition cameras tracking the lobby would instantly flag his face for the federal authorities. Patricia adjusted her modest dress, adopting a fragile and trembling posture, ready to execute her medical emergency performance. She hunched her shoulders and slowed her walking pace, carefully constructing the visual illusion of a deeply sick and broken woman on the verge of physical collapse. They approached the main reception desk, demanding to see Vincent. The immaculate receptionist did not ask for their identification or request them to wait in a holding area. She simply tapped a command on her glowing terminal and directed them toward a specific bank of private express elevators reserved exclusively for senior executive partners. The heavy metal doors slid open instantly, swallowing the three desperate individuals. Sterling pressed the glowing button for the 42nd floor, entirely unaware that he was sealing his own permanent doom. The elevator shot upward with a silent and terrifying velocity, leaving their stomachs behind as they rapidly ascended the towering skyscraper. The sudden shift in air pressure popped their ears, amplifying the dense and suffocating silence inside the small metal box. Patricia mentally rehearsed her opening lines, preparing to shed fabricated tears and beg for absolute forgiveness. Connor gripped the metal handrail of the elevator car, desperately trying to steady his violent shaking. Sterling stared at his own haggard reflection in the polished brass doors, still fully believing he could outsmart the simple man he had mercilessly mocked at the wedding reception. The steel doors parted smoothly, revealing a sleek and heavily guarded reception area entirely devoid of warmth or welcome. They stepped out onto the thick premium carpet, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just walked directly into the center of the slaughterhouse. The receptionist offered a tight, professional smile and guided the three desperate individuals down a long corridor, lined with abstract modern art and polished chrome fixtures. She pressed her palm against a biometric scanner, causing the heavy frosted glass doors of the executive suite to glide open with a soft hydraulic hiss. Patricia stepped off the thick carpeting of the hallway and onto the polished black marble of the inner sanctum. Connor followed closely behind her, his breathing shallow and rapid. Sterling brought up the rear, aggressively adjusting his ruined tuxedo jacket in a pathetic attempt to project an air of impatient authority. The receptionist did not follow them inside the room. She simply turned around, and the solid glass doors sealed shut behind them, locking the trio inside the massive boardroom. The space was immense. Vast windows offered a vertigo-inducing view of the Chicago skyline, completely dwarfing the people standing inside. The air conditioning hummed with a low, precise frequency, dropping the ambient temperature to a distinctly uncomfortable chill. In the absolute center of the room sat a massive table carved from a single slab of dark mahogany. At the far end of the long wooden expanse sat Vincent. The trio froze collectively, rooted to the cold marble floor. The man sitting quietly before them bore absolutely no resemblance to the defeated, discarded husband Patricia thought she had left behind. Vincent wore a pristine midnight blue suit, meticulously tailored to fit his broad shoulders perfectly. A crisp white shirt and a solid slate silk tie completed the commanding ensemble. There was no trace of the weary, compliant father Connor remembered. Vincent sat with a rigid, terrifying stillness. His hands rested flat on the mahogany surface, projecting absolute dominance and unyielding control. Sitting directly to his right was Sullivan. The ruthless corporate attorney was methodically sorting through a towering stack of thick, leather-bound legal binders, snapping them shut with loud, intimidating cracks that echoed sharply across the quiet room. The sheer power dynamic shifted instantly, suffocating the air out of the lungs of the intruders. The stark reality of the situation began to heavily weigh down on them completely, erasing the arrogant assumptions they had carried into the skyscraper. Patricia forced her paralyzed legs to move forward. She remembered her fabricated script and immediately launched into her rehearsed performance. She let her shoulders droop, adopting a fragile, trembling posture. She forced wet tears to pool in the corners of her eyes and let out a weak, pathetic sob. She took 3 stumbling steps toward the mahogany table, reaching her hands out toward her former husband. She began to vocalize her manufactured medical crisis, whining about her failing heart and the terrifying ambulance ride she claimed to have just endured. She fully expected Vincent to leap from his leather chair and rush to her side, offering comfort and unquestioning financial support. He did not move a single inch. As she took her 4th step forward, Vincent simply raised his right hand. He did not speak a single word. He did not glare at her. He merely lifted his palm into the air, holding it perfectly still. The gesture was executed with such cold, absolute finality that it struck Patricia like a physical blow to the chest. Her voice caught painfully in her throat. The fake tears instantly dried up, completely shattering her manipulative facade. She stopped dead in her tracks, entirely incapable of taking another step toward him. Sterling bristled at the blatant display of dominance. The venture capitalist felt his own fabricated authority evaporating rapidly in the freezing room. He pushed past Connor and stepped right up to the edge of the massive table. He slammed his dusty hands down onto the polished wood, attempting to physically reclaim the shifting power dynamic. He let out a harsh, abrasive scoff, staring directly down at Vincent. Sterling aggressively demanded an immediate explanation for this theatrical setup. He pointed a shaking finger at Sullivan, openly mocking the presence of the high-priced attorney. He loudly questioned how a discarded broke retiree could possibly afford the retainer for one of the most ruthless corporate litigators in the entire financial district. Sterling sneered, claiming Vincent must have emptied his pathetic little pension fund just to rent this boardroom for an hour to play dress-up and intimidate his betters. He demanded Vincent sign over the remaining trust fund assets immediately so they could all return to the real world and handle actual corporate business. He tried to project the immense gravity of a billionaire titan, but his voice cracked slightly, revealing the absolute panic boiling just beneath his skin. Vincent remained entirely impassive, allowing the frantic shouting to bounce off the glass walls and fade into pathetic silence. He did not offer a defensive explanation or engage in a petty shouting match. He reached into the interior pocket of his custom suit jacket and withdrew a sleek black remote control. He aimed the device toward the ceiling and pressed a single button. The room darkened slightly as automated blackout blinds slid down over the massive windows. A highly advanced high-definition projector screen descended silently from the ceiling, directly behind Vincent. The digital projector hummed to life, casting a brilliant white rectangle across the fabric. Vincent looked directly into the bloodshot eyes of the man standing across the table. He spoke for the very first time, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried no anger, only the terrifying weight of absolute certainty. He informed Sterling that his assumption regarding the legal retainer was fundamentally incorrect. Vincent calmly stated he did not merely afford the expensive hourly services of the attorney sitting beside him. He pressed the remote again. A highly complex corporate organizational chart flashed onto the screen, displaying a vast network of global holding companies, real estate acquisitions, and offshore financial trusts. Vincent told Sterling he did not rent the boardroom. He owned the entire steel and glass skyscraper they were currently standing inside. Connor stared at the massive organizational chart glowing brightly on the projector screen. His eyes darted frantically across the complex web of subsidiary corporations and limited liability companies, tracing the lines upward to the undeniable truth. He saw the specific holding company that had frozen the family trust explicitly listed as a minor asset under his father's vast umbrella. He saw the anonymous firm that had just aggressively purchased all of Sterling's commercial debts displayed clearly on the board. The crushing reality of the situation finally penetrated his thick skull. His father had not been defeated by the divorce proceedings 2 years prior. His father had orchestrated their entire existence from the shadows, allowing them to hang themselves with their own unchecked greed. Connor felt his knees weaken significantly, threatening to buckle under his own body weight. He realized he had just committed federal wire fraud and systemic forgery explicitly to steal money from a man who already owned the bank, the trust, and their entire financial futures. Patricia stood frozen, entirely unable to process the staggering numbers projecting behind her former husband. The net worth displayed on the screen completely eclipsed anything Sterling had ever claimed to possess. The devastating realization washed over her that she had willingly walked away from genuine astronomical wealth to chain herself to a fraudulent, bankrupt con artist. Vincent sat in absolute silence watching the three individuals who had tried to destroy him slowly realize they had effectively buried themselves alive. Vincent did not allow the shocking revelation of his real estate ownership to settle before pressing the next button on his sleek remote control. The complex organizational chart vanished from the massive projector screen, instantly replaced by the stark, high-definition surveillance footage captured inside the industrial storage facility. The pristine acoustics of the executive boardroom suddenly filled with the harsh, abrasive sounds of tearing cardboard and shattering glass. Patricia gasped sharply, taking an involuntary physical step backward as the horrific image of her current husband completely filled the bright screen. The video displayed Sterling acting like a feral, desperate animal, violently overturning plastic bins and trampling over decades of carefully preserved family history. The immaculate billionaire she thought she married was exposed as a frantic scavenger covered in gray dust and sweating profusely in a dark concrete room. Vincent kept his eyes locked on Patricia, forcing her to witness the destruction of her carefully cultivated lies. The audio feed from the parabolic microphone surged through the hidden surround sound speakers, broadcasting every ragged breath and desperate curse with terrifying clarity. Sterling raised his dust-covered hands on the screen and unleashed his vicious verbal assault against Connor. The venture capitalist screamed that Patricia was nothing more than a suffocating, deeply vain social climber. His recorded voice echoed across the mahogany table, explicitly confessing he had never harbored a single ounce of genuine affection for her. He ruthlessly detailed how he only endured her endless superficial demands to gain proximity to the massive fortune he wrongly believed Vincent had hidden away. He admitted loud and clear that their entire glamorous wedding was a calculated sham, designed exclusively to salvage his own sinking firm and plug the bleeding holes in his fraudulent corporate accounts. He successfully exposed his entire fake existence in one brutal monologue. Patricia stood frozen, clutching the back of a heavy leather chair to keep her trembling legs from giving out entirely. The polished facade of her perfect, wealthy existence violently shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces right in front of her eyes. She slowly turned her head to look at Sterling, standing merely 3 feet away. The man she abandoned her family for was not a titan of industry or a financial savior. He was a broke, desperate parasite who used her as a disposable tool to chase a ghost. Sterling refused to meet her gaze, staring blankly at the floor, as his own recorded voice continued to humiliate him in front of the most powerful men in the city. The betrayal cut through Patricia with a cold, physical pain, completely erasing the arrogant confidence she carried into the skyscraper just minutes prior. She finally understood she was now completely ruined. The surveillance footage on the giant screen shifted its focus as Connor aggressively stepped into the center of the frame. The boardroom fell entirely silent except for the digital playback of the young man shouting back at his stepfather. The hidden microphone captured the exact moment Connor lost his temper and actively dug his own grave. His voice boomed through the pristine office, explicitly detailing the massive legal risks he personally assumed. He screamed that he meticulously forged the notary stamps and falsified the official signatures on the trust transfer documents with his own bare hands. He demanded respect for committing federal wire fraud and identity theft to save Sterling from absolute bankruptcy. The undeniable confession of severe federal crimes washed over the conference table, cementing his guilt beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt. The absolute finality of his shouted words hung heavily in the freezing room. The sheer gravity of his own recorded words struck Connor with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. The arrogant illusion of being a slick corporate player instantly evaporated, leaving behind a terrified child facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. A sudden, violent wave of nausea hijacked his entire nervous system. Connor stumbled blindly away from the mahogany table, his hands clutching his stomach. He collided heavily against the glass wall and dropped sharply to his knees. He grabbed a sleek metal wastebasket positioned near a potted fern and violently emptied his stomach into it. The harsh sounds of his physical sickness echoed through the cold room, providing a pathetic soundtrack to his absolute downfall. Vincent watched his biological son retch and heave without displaying a single micro-expression of paternal pity or concern. Sullivan remained seated perfectly upright, observing the complete psychological collapse of their adversaries, with the clinical detachment of a scientist watching a successful experiment conclude. Vincent pressed the remote control one final time, stopping the video playback and plunging the large screen into total darkness. He slowly reached toward the thick, leather-bound legal binder resting on the table directly in front of Sullivan. Vincent opened the heavy cover and extracted a single document printed on thick, premium paper. He placed his hand flat against the document and deliberately slid it across the smooth, polished surface of the mahogany table. The paper glided perfectly, stopping exactly halfway between the trembling hands of Patricia and the rigid, sweating figure of Sterling. Vincent commanded them to read the highlighted section at the bottom of the page so everyone in the room could understand the absolute finality of their situation. Sterling leaned forward mechanically, his eyes slowly scanning the complex and dense legal terminology printed clearly on the official deed. His breath caught sharply in his throat as his brain processed the final devastating piece of the puzzle. The document was the master deed of ownership for the anonymous corporate holding firm that had completely frozen the family trust earlier that week. It was the exact same shadowy entity that aggressively purchased every single ounce of his toxic commercial debt and immediately triggered the devastating default clauses. Vincent sat back in his large leather chair, folding his hands neatly in his lap. He spoke with a quiet, terrifying authority, informing them he was the sole and absolute proprietor of that holding firm. He revealed he was the invisible creditor who systematically dismantled their entire fraudulent empire over the past 72 hours without ever leaving his office. Vincent calmly articulated the precise mechanics of his ultimate trap, making sure they understood the sheer scale of his massive retaliation. He explained exactly how he patiently waited for Sterling to over-leverage his assets before purchasing the paper on his loans for pennies on the dollar. He detailed how he personally ordered the immediate foreclosure on the sprawling suburban estate, leaving Patricia completely homeless with a single phone call. He clarified that every panicked decision they made, the desperate break in the forged signatures, the frantic drive to the city, had all been perfectly anticipated and completely orchestrated by his own hand. He owned their debts, he owned their foreclosed mansion, and he currently held the undisputed recorded evidence of their federal crimes. Vincent leaned forward slightly, letting his cold gaze pierce through the last remaining shreds of their fabricated arrogance. He informed them they possessed absolutely nothing and existed entirely at his absolute mercy forever. The absolute silence in the massive glass-walled boardroom stretched until it became a heavy physical pressure pressing against the chests of the intruders. The final legal document, resting on the polished mahogany table, was not just a piece of paper, but a granite gravestone for a completely fraudulent empire. Sterling stared down at the undeniable proof of his total financial annihilation. His meticulously crafted persona of a wealthy and untouchable titan completely evaporated, leaving only a cornered and desperate animal in a ruined tuxedo. The veins in his neck bulged visibly against his dust-stained collar as a guttural sound tore its way up his throat. It was a raw, primal roar of pure, predatory rage masking his profound terror. Sterling planted his shaking hands flat on the heavy wooden table and violently launched his entire body weight forward. He scrambled aggressively over the polished surface, scattering Sullivan's thick, leather-bound legal binders and knocking heavy crystal water glasses to the carpeted floor. He reached blindly toward Vincent with outstretched, clawing hands, completely consumed by the irrational and violent desire to inflict physical harm on the man who had just systematically dismantled his entire existence. Vincent did not flinch or lean back in his heavy leather chair. He remained perfectly still, simply watching the pathetic and primitive display of lost control unfold before him. The heavy frosted glass doors of the executive suite did not merely open to interrupt the violence. They exploded inward with a deafening crash that violently shook the surrounding glass walls. A highly coordinated tactical team of federal agents flooded into the room. They had been stationed silently in the adjacent office suite, monitoring the live audio feed and waiting for the precise legal threshold to be crossed. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute military precision. Before Sterling could even extend his grasping fingers toward Vincent, the lead agent hit him with the blunt force of a speeding vehicle. The heavy impact drove the venture capitalist sideways off the mahogany table and sent him crashing brutally onto the cold marble floor. Two more heavily armored agents immediately descended on his thrashing body, pinning his shoulders and driving their heavy knees firmly into his lower back. Sterling kicked wildly against the polished stone, his face contorted in severe physical pain and utter humiliation as he screamed empty threats of legal retribution. The agents ignored his frantic shouting, entirely treating him with the cold, mechanical efficiency reserved for common violent street criminals. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the room as they violently wrenched his arms behind his back and locked his wrists together. A tall, stern-looking senior agent stepped forward, holding a formal federal warrant. He looked down at the disgraced and bleeding billionaire and read the federal charges in a loud, booming voice that completely drowned out the pathetic protests. He was being formally placed under arrest for orchestrating massive systemic wire fraud and executing grand larceny on an unprecedented federal scale. The lead agent confirmed that the evidence extracted from the digital file named Kich Bon Ong Da Den Mao 1_14.docx provided the exact probable cause needed to legally breach the room and execute the takedown. He explicitly listed the fraudulent bridge loans detailed in the federal warrant application tied directly to the encrypted evidence package labeled Kich Bon Ong Da Den 2_14. DOCX before forcing the disgraced billionaire to his knees. Sterling stopped struggling and pressed his cheek against the cold floor, finally realizing that his expensive lawyers could not save him from a meticulously documented federal indictment. Connor watched the brutal physical subjugation of his powerful stepfather with wide, unblinking eyes. The sight of the untouchable billionaire being treated like a common street thug completely broke whatever fragile mental fortitude the young man had left. The sheer and crushing reality of a federal prison sentence crashed down upon his shoulders, suffocating his lungs and turning his legs to water. He scrambled away from the glass wall and crawled awkwardly across the premium carpet toward the head of the table. He threw himself heavily onto his knees, right at his father's feet, completely abandoning any remaining shred of personal dignity. Tears streamed rapidly down his pale face, mixing with the cold sweat of absolute total terror. He clasped his trembling hands together and began to sob uncontrollably, begging his father for immediate salvation and legal mercy. Connor frantically changed his entire defensive narrative, claiming he had been completely brainwashed and psychologically manipulated by the toxic environment his mother and stepfather had created. He pleaded that he was just a naive kid who had made a terrible mistake under extreme psychological duress and physical threat. He reached out to grab the hem of his father's pristine suit jacket, promising he would do absolutely anything to make things right if Vincent would just call off the federal agents and protect him. Vincent slowly turned his head and looked down at his biological son. His facial expression remained an impenetrable mask of cold and calculated discipline. There was no trace of hidden anger, no lingering sorrow, and absolutely no paternal mercy shining in his eyes. He looked at Connor not as a misguided and innocent child, but as a fully formed adult who had actively and willingly participated in a malicious criminal conspiracy to destroy him. Vincent spoke in a quiet, level voice that easily cut through the pathetic, wet sobbing echoing from the floor. He told his son that genuine loyalty cannot be forged. The profound finality of that single sentence hung heavily in the freezing air conditioning of the boardroom. It was a definitive and permanent rejection, cementing the absolute end of their blood relationship. Two federal agents stepped forward from the shadows of the shattered doorway, separating Connor from his father. They hauled the weeping young man roughly to his feet, grabbing his arms with unyielding physical force. Connor screamed for his mother to help him, but his voice was immediately drowned out as the agents formally read him his rights under the law. They informed him he was being arrested as a fully aware and active accomplice in a coordinated federal forgery and wire fraud operation. The heavy steel cuffs locked securely around Connor's wrists, mirroring the exact grim fate of his fallen stepfather. The agents forcefully marched him out of the boardroom, his pathetic and broken cries echoing down the long marble corridor until they were completely swallowed by the distance. Patricia was left standing completely alone in the center of the massive corporate room. She stood perfectly motionless amidst the scattered legal papers and overturned leather chairs. The absolute silence that fell over the executive suite was terrifying and deafening. She looked at the empty space on the polished floor, where her wealthy husband had just been pinned and publicly humiliated. She looked at the shattered doorway where her only biological son had just been dragged away in heavy steel chains. She slowly lowered her vacant gaze to her own trembling hands. She was clutching her expensive imported designer purse with a painful white-knuckled grip. The luxurious leather bag was completely empty, containing absolutely no money, no brass keys to a sprawling suburban mansion, and no manipulative leverage left to bargain with. She had systematically alienated and discarded the only man who had ever truly loved and protected her. She had aggressively chained herself to a parasitic fraud and actively encouraged the criminal corruption of her own child. The total and unyielding consequences of her boundless arrogance and toxic greed finally crashed down upon her narrow shoulders with a crushing physical weight. She was officially stripped of her lavish home, her fake glamorous marriage, and her entire future. She stood shivering in the freezing room, staring blankly at Vincent across the long mahogany table, realizing with absolute horror that she had absolutely nothing left in the world. The warm golden sunlight of late afternoon bathed the expansive stone terrace in a rich amber glow, as Vincent sat comfortably overlooking the terracotta rooftops of Lisbon. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out endlessly before him, forming a vast expanse of deep blue that met the cloudless horizon. A gentle sea breeze drifted up from the coastline, carrying the faint, sweet scent of blooming bougainvillea, mixed with the crisp salt of the ocean air. He raised a small porcelain cup to his lips and took a slow, measured sip of his dark espresso. The rich, bitter flavor grounded him entirely in the present moment, completely detaching his mind from the chaotic world he had permanently left behind. The ambient noise of the vibrant, historic city below blended into a soothing and rhythmic hum. He listened to the distant mechanical rattle of a vintage yellow tram navigating the steep cobblestone streets and the faint melodic sounds of a street musician playing a traditional Portuguese guitar. This beautiful sun-drenched terrace was the quiet sanctuary he had meticulously planned for himself. It was a fortress of solitude built firmly upon a foundation of absolute truth and unwavering discipline. The heavy toxic burdens of corporate warfare and manipulative family dynamics were completely gone. He wore a simple, loose-fitting linen shirt and lightweight trousers, projecting a stark departure from the rigid tailored suits that had defined his former grueling existence. He watched a lone seagull glide effortlessly on the warm thermal currents, feeling a profound sense of lightness expand inside his chest. The quiet serenity of the peaceful afternoon was gently interrupted by the soft vibration of a secure mobile phone resting on the glass patio table. Vincent placed his porcelain saucer down and picked up the device. The encrypted screen displayed a private numerical code indicating his attorney was calling. Vincent accepted the transatlantic connection and lifted the phone to his ear. Sullivan spoke in his usual crisp, professional cadence, completely devoid of any emotional inflection or unnecessary pleasantries. The ruthless corporate attorney was calling to deliver the final conclusive report on the legal fallout they had orchestrated back in Chicago. Vincent leaned back in his comfortable rattan chair, instructing the lawyer to proceed with the situational update. Sullivan delivered the information with the precise and calculating efficiency of a military briefing. The federal prosecution against the fraudulent venture capitalist had moved with unprecedented speed, completely overwhelming any frantic attempts to secure a high-priced defense team. The sheer volume of undeniable digital evidence had crushed any possibility of a drawn-out legal battle. Sterling was officially facing 20 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The severe charges of systemic wire fraud, grand larceny, and financial conspiracy had stuck perfectly to his record. Sullivan described how the former billionaire had completely broken down during his final sentencing, hearing entirely stripped of his arrogant bravado and reduced to a weeping hollow shell. The invisible holding firm Vincent controlled had successfully recovered every single stolen asset, leaving the criminal with a negative net worth and a lifetime of institutional confinement. Vincent listened to the grim fate of the man who had tried to steal his life without feeling a single ounce of triumphant vindication. It was simply the correct mathematical outcome of a deeply flawed and greedy equation. Sullivan then shifted the focus of the detailed briefing to the next item on the legal docket. He outlined the current judicial status of the biological son. The young man had been entirely abandoned by his stepfather the very second the federal agents breached the executive boardroom. Left to face the crushing weight of the justice system alone, the boy had rapidly folded under the intense pressure of the interrogation. Sullivan explained that the federal prosecutors had offered a strict plea deal in exchange for his full cooperation in dismantling the remaining offshore accounts. The son had officially accepted the non-negotiable terms. He was formally sentenced to 5 years in a federal correctional facility for his active participation in the forgery and wire fraud scheme. Vincent looked out at the rolling blue waves as he absorbed the definitive information. He did not feel a sudden surge of paternal grief or lingering regret. He merely acknowledged the absolute inevitability of the bleak situation. The boy had made a conscious and deliberate choice to align himself with toxic greed and blatant criminality. He had willingly forged secure legal documents to destroy his own father. The 5-year sentence was the necessary and unavoidable price of that betrayal. Vincent knew that a federal prison environment would either break the young man completely or force him to finally build a genuine character from the ground up. It was simply no longer his responsibility to manage. Sullivan paused briefly before delivering the final piece of the comprehensive operational report. The attorney outlined the current living situation of the former wife. The rapid and aggressive foreclosure of the sprawling suburban estate had left her completely destitute and entirely alienated from her wealthy social circles. The country club elites had immediately severed all contact, completely terrified of being publicly associated with a massive federal fraud scandal. She had been forcefully ordered to surrender her designer wardrobe, her expensive diamond jewelry, and her luxury leased vehicles to satisfy the relentless debt collectors circling her ruined life. Sullivan provided her exact current location with cold, clinical detachment. The woman was now living in a cramped, dimly lit studio apartment, located in a highly undesirable industrial neighborhood on the extreme edge of the city. To pay the exorbitant monthly rent on the miserable unit, she had been forced to secure menial physical employment. The vain individual who had spent decades demanding absolute luxury and mocking the working class was currently working exhausting night shifts at a greasy roadside diner. Sullivan described how she spent her late evenings wiping down sticky vinyl tables, serving cheap coffee to exhausted truck drivers, and enduring the harsh, unyielding realities of minimum wage survival. The absolute vanity that had defined her entire existence had been violently stripped away, leaving behind a tired, broken woman trapped forever in a cage of her own making. Vincent allowed a long moment of silence to pass over the secure cellular connection. The total and complete destruction of their fraudulent reality had been executed flawlessly. There was one final logistical matter to address before closing the thick book on Chicago forever. Vincent asked his attorney for the official financial status of the foreclosed family estate. Sullivan confirmed that the massive property had been aggressively liquidated on the open residential market. The rapid cash sale had generated a highly significant amount of liquid capital. Per Vincent's explicit and binding legal instructions, the lawyer had wired the entire sum of the proceeds directly to a reputable educational charity. The massive financial windfall was currently being used to fund comprehensive scholarship programs and build modern community centers for underprivileged youth across the struggling city districts. The toxic legacy of the enormous house where greed was cultivated and entitlement was learned had been completely erased from the map. The money was now serving a genuine noble purpose, actively repairing the very communities that corrupt men routinely exploited. The financial and moral cleansing was absolute and final. Sullivan concluded his thorough briefing by formally stating that all legal avenues were closed, all accounts were permanently settled, and the operational file was officially sealed. Vincent thanked the brilliant attorney for his flawless execution and unyielding loyalty over the grueling years. They exchanged brief professional farewells before Vincent firmly tapped the glass screen, disconnecting the transatlantic call. He placed the mobile phone face down on the table, completely severing his final digital tie to the past. He picked up his porcelain cup and finished the last cold drops of the dark espresso. The sun began its slow, dramatic descent toward the ocean, casting vibrant streaks of deep purple and fiery orange across the clear Portuguese sky. The warm evening air wrapped around his shoulders, carrying the rhythmic, soothing sound of the Atlantic waves crashing gently against the distant rocky shoreline. Vincent closed his eyes and breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the clean, salty sea air. A slow, genuine smile spread across his weathered face. He had not sought loud, explosive revenge or messy public confrontations to heal his wounds. He had simply allowed the undeniable truth to act as a silent, unstoppable force of nature. He had meticulously restored his own profound peace through the execution of absolute, silent justice. The magnificent sunset glowing warmly against his skin felt like a perfect new beginning. True power does not require a loud voice or a public spectacle, because it resides in the quiet, absolute certainty of one's actions and the unbreakable boundaries set against toxic manipulation. When faced with profound betrayal, the most effective response is rarely explosive anger, but rather a calm, methodical restructuring of reality where consequences naturally align with actions. Greed and vanity eventually construct their own inescapable prisons, while patience and silent justice forge a path to genuine liberation. Leaving behind those who value wealth over loyalty allows you to breathe the clean air of your own restored dignity. Share this story to remind others that silent justice is always the most powerful form of closure.